before the Dragon War became a chapter in Nordic history, dragons were already part of the shape of the world. They were not simply large animals that happened to breathe fire. In the old stories, they were voices made flesh, creatures whose words could move the air, fracture stone, and command the attention of every living thing nearby. Their language was not decoration. It was a force. A dragon could speak a name and make that name feel heavier. It could speak a command and turn sound into violence. To imagine Skyrim in that distant age, let the modern roads disappear. Let the watchtowers fall away. The mountains remain, but the settlements below them are younger, rougher, and less certain. The Nords are still becoming a people of this northern land. Their songs have not yet gathered into the familiar shape of later legend. Above them, dragons circle through weather and cloud, ancient enough to seem like natural laws. The first point to hold gently is that the Dragon War was not an ordinary rebellion. It was a revolt against a hierarchy that had placed dragons above mortals. The dragons claimed reverence, tribute, and obedience. Some may have ruled through terror, some through religion, and some through the sheer majesty of their power. The sources are later, partisan, and shaped by memory. So we should not pretend to know the daily details of every dragon temple. What survives is the pattern. Worship below, command above, and a growing human conviction that the arrangement could not last forever. Tonight, we will move slowly through that pattern. We will listen for the difference between a dragon as a beast, a dragon as a king, and a dragon as a voice that believes the world itself should answer. There is also a quiet distinction between being feared and being worshipped. A dragon may accept offerings without needing belief, while a priesthood needs belief to make its work feel inevitable. That difference would have mattered to ordinary families. The ritual might have been familiar even when the heart had gone elsewhere. In the space between public ceremony and private doubt, resistance could begin. The old dragon cult was not only a collection of priests wearing masks. It was a political order, a way of arranging the world so that the presence of a dragon could be felt even when no winged shadow crossed the sky. At the center stood the dragon, understood as older, stronger, and closer to the first principles of creation. Beneath it stood priests and officials who translated draconic authority into human law. Their tombs, shrines, and mountain sanctuaries became places where power could be made permanent. A mortal ruler dies. A stone hall can remain. A mask can be carried forward. A ritual can teach a child to kneel before the name of someone who vanished centuries ago. This is why the dragon priests matter in the story. They are not interchangeable villains. Each mask suggests a local tradition, a relationship between a particular dragon and the people who served it, and a style of control that could be both ceremonial and frightening. The priests made the cult visible. They kept records, guarded burial places, directed offerings, and enforced the expectation that dragons deserved obedience. It is tempting to picture every Nord under this system as secretly waiting for a rebellion. But the truth was probably uneven. Some people may have feared the dragons. Some may have believed in them. Some may have found security in a clear hierarchy, even a cruel one. Others may have lived far from the great temples and experienced the cult through taxes, military demands, or the sudden appearance of a priest. Oppression is rarely felt in one identical way by everyone beneath it. The long quiet before the war, then, was not empty. It was filled with rituals, negotiations, forced loyalty, and the slow education of resistance. Every grave mound became a political statement. Every mask turned an absent dragon into a present authority. The Nords who opposed the dragons were not a single army waiting in perfect formation. They were settlements, clans, warriors, priests, farmers, hunters, and leaders whose experiences accumulated over time. resistance had to become practical before it could become legendary. A people cannot defeat the sky by courage alone. They need messengers who can cross winter roads, strongholds that can survive attack, food stores that will not burn, and leaders who can keep separate communities moving in the same direction. The old accounts often compress this complexity into a few heroic names. That compression is useful for song, but it can hide the patient work that makes a revolt possible. Imagine a village below a ridge where a dragon has passed. The fire is gone, but the work of rebuilding has only begun. Someone clears the roof beams. Someone searches for missing family. Someone counts the grain. Someone remembers the direction the dragon flew. Those quiet actions are part of the war too. The Dragon War was fought in an age when the Nords were learning that survival could become identity. Their relationship with the mountains mattered. Their burial traditions mattered. Their memory of earlier migrations mattered. When they spoke of freedom, they were not speaking into an empty idea. They were defending homes, ancestors, and a future in which their children would not be born already assigned a place beneath a dragon throne. The later image of the Dragonborn can make it seem as though one chosen figure solved what generations could not. But even a hero needs a people ready to recognize a possibility. The Nords created that readiness through endurance. They learned the paths between barrows. They carried messages through snow. They watched the skies. Their rebellion was made of thousands of small refusals before it became a story about voices powerful enough to challenge dragons. Among the figures connected to the Dragon War, Miraak is the one whose story refuses to settle into a single shape. He is remembered as the first Dragonborn, a mortal with a connection to dragon power that made him uniquely capable of confronting the beings who ruled the North. The title sounds like an answer to the war, but Miraak's life also warns us that a liberator can carry private ambitions into a public struggle. The old sources are incomplete and sometimes filtered through later events. We know Miraak served as a dragon priest before turning against the dragons. We know he possessed knowledge of the Thu'um and used it against them. We know his story reaches beyond the dragon war into Apocrypha, Hermias Mora, and a long captivity that changed the meaning of his rebellion. What we should not do is smooth every contradiction into a neat biography. A person can resist a tyrant without becoming gentle. A priest can betray the order that raised him without becoming loyal to the people beneath it. Miraak's importance lies partly in that tension. He showed that dragon authority was not invulnerable from below. The power of the dragon language could be learned, redirected, and returned against its original masters. Yet his later ambition suggests that the struggle may have been personal as well as moral. Perhaps he wanted freedom for the Nords. Perhaps he wanted freedom for himself. Perhaps those desires were never separate in his mind. As the first Dragonborn, he became a bridge between mortal aspiration and draconic power. Bridges can carry people toward liberation, but they can also lead somewhere dangerous. When we look at his mask, his name, or the distant island where his story ended, we are looking at an early warning. Defeating a hierarchy does not automatically teach anyone how to live without one. The Thu'um gives the dragon war its most intimate image. A dragon's power is not only in claw, wing, and flame. It is in speech. To answer the dragon with a mortal voice is therefore more than an attack. It is a refusal to accept that language belongs to the powerful alone. The graybeards of later Skyrim speak of the voice as discipline, breath, and understanding. The ancient war was harsher. Words became weapons because the enemy had made words into weapons first. We can imagine the training without pretending to know every method. A student stands in cold air. The lungs learn patience. The mouth learns the shape of a syllable. The instructor does not ask for shouting, but for alignment, breath, intention, and meaning moving together. Somewhere beyond the walls, a dragon passes over the mountain. Snow loosens from a ledge. The student listens. This is the calm beneath the spectacle of the shout. A battle may last moments, but the capacity to speak against a dragon is built over years. The later vocabulary of the Thu'um gives us words such as fuss, row, da. But the ancient war was not a video game menu of powers. It was a culture of sound, and its use carried danger. A voice can break a door and still fail to break fear. It can throw a body from a ridge and still leave the old political order intact. The mortals needed more than force. They needed a new understanding of themselves, not subjects who had borrowed a dragon's language, but people who could stand inside that language and make it answer to mortal purpose. In that sense, the voice was both technology and philosophy. It changed what a human being believed a human being could be. There was no single battlefield that contains the whole dragon war. Its landscape would have been scattered across mountains, valleys, settlements, and sacred places. A dragon can move farther in an hour than a human army can move in a day. That changes the rhythm of conflict. The sky becomes a road for the enemy. A warning fire may be seen too late. A stone wall may be strong against soldiers and useless against a winged creature that lands behind it. The Nords had to learn how to make the ground matter. They used narrow passes, hidden approaches, old ruins, and weather. They watched where dragons preferred to land. They searched for moments when cloud and darkness reduced the advantage of the open sky. The dragon cult, meanwhile, turned architecture into defense. Tombs became fortresses. Priests kept relics hidden. Loyalists could carry news between sanctuaries or preserve the old order after a defeat. The war, therefore, moved in layers. There was the visible clash between dragon and warrior. Beneath it was the struggle over graves, stories, food, and allegiance. A village that refused tribute might be punished. A priest who abandoned a mask might become a symbol for other defections. A dragon burial site might be guarded not because the dead dragon could rise immediately, but because the bones themselves represented a claim to power. We should leave room for uncertainty in the details. Later Nordic legends naturally magnify victories and simplify defeats. Still, the shape is clear enough to feel. The war was long, exhausting, and uneven. It asked mortals to fight an enemy that could retreat into the clouds, return at night, and make one failure feel like a judgment from the heavens. The courage of the Nords was not a bright flash. It was the decision to keep rebuilding the next morning. The dragon priests remain after the dragons disappear, and that fact gives the war its haunted afterlife. A priest's tomb is a room where political history has been sealed with a body. The mask is both an object and a sentence. It tells the visitor that the old order once had a face, a name, and an institution strong enough to prepare for eternity. In the quiet of a Nordic crypt, the war can feel finished and unfinished at the same time. Dust covers the floor, but the hierarchy is still arranged in stone. The priest lies beneath a sarcophagus. The corridors preserve offerings. The architecture directs the living toward the dead. Some priests may have continued to serve their dragons after the wider order collapsed. Some were defeated and buried by enemies. Some became local spirits in later stories, their original political meaning blurred into a monster encounter. We should be careful not to treat every undead guardian as a precise historical record. Tombs are evidence, but they are also propaganda. A burial chamber wants to be remembered in a certain way. It magnifies the status of the person inside and turns defeat into endurance. The mask can conceal the face, but concealment is not the same as anonymity. It creates a new face, one that belongs to office and ritual. When an adventurer enters centuries later, the mask seems to awaken the past. Perhaps it is more accurate to say that the past never entirely slept. The cult's forms remained available. The hall, the altar, the priestly title, the promise that power can survive the death of its master. This is why the dragon war cannot end simply when the last dragon is driven away. A kingdom can change its rulers and still inherit the habits of obedience. The tomb asks us to listen for that residue, the soft continuation of an old command in a room where no living dragon is present. At some point, the balance changed. The dragons who had seemed permanent were hunted, challenged, and forced into retreat. The old order cracked. But even here, certainty should be used carefully. The surviving records do not give us a complete military ledger. We do not know every alliance, every betrayal, or every settlement that changed sides. What we do know is that dragons ceased to rule Skyrim in the way they once had. Their priests lost authority. Their shrines became ruins. Their names became stories told around fires rather than commands heard from the clouds. For the Nords, victory must have carried mixed emotions. Freedom can feel like relief, but it can also feel like the silence after a storm, when everyone waits to see whether the roof will hold. If the dragons had been worshipped for generations, then their absence created a spiritual problem as well as a political one. What replaces the god who was also a tyrant? What becomes of the priesthood trained to serve him? What do you do with a tomb built for a future that no longer arrives? Some answers would come through new Nordic traditions, new heroes, and new interpretations of the voice. Others would remain unresolved in abandoned sanctuaries. The dragon bones beneath the earth preserved a different kind of power, proof that the impossible could die. Yet death did not erase fear. The people who survived the war carried memories forward, and memories can outlive the conditions that created them. A child born after the last great battle might never see a dragon, but still learn that the mountains hide old enemies. The war became ancestry. It its victories became moral lessons. Its losses became warnings. And when the old stories were repeated, the line between history and myth grew thinner. The dragons had been defeated as rulers, but they were not defeated as symbols. They became the measure by which later generations understood power, pride, and the danger of believing any throne will last forever. Alduin belongs to the Dragon War in a way that reaches beyond ordinary chronology. He is remembered as the greatest of dragons, the World Eater. And in the ancient conflict, he appears both as ruler and as a figure whose relation to time is strange. The later stories of his return make the old war feel like a wound that never closed. A dragon can be killed, buried, and remembered. Yet the idea of Alduin remains larger than a single corpse. We should separate what the episode can state from what it can only contemplate. Alduin's title carries theological weight. His role as the end of the world, or as a being associated with the end of cycles, is interpreted differently across traditions. The Nords who feared him, the priests who served him, and the later heroes who opposed him did not necessarily mean the same thing by the name. Even the title World Eater can sound like a literal description, a prophecy, or a ritual claim. The uncertainty is part of the atmosphere. In a Nordic crypt, a tablet may preserve a warning without explaining the entire cosmos behind it. The Dragon War becomes more than a rebellion against local kingship when Alduin enters the frame. It becomes a confrontation with the possibility that history itself can be consumed. The ancient Nords fought to survive their present, but their songs also imagined a future where the world would be tested again. When Alduin was displaced from his age and later returned, that future seemed to arrive out of order. The old war had not stayed buried. In this sense, the Dragonborn of the later era does not merely repeat an ancient victory. They inherit an unfinished conversation between mortal voice and dragon time. The sky opens again, old name is spoken again, and the bones beneath the barrows remind us that every return is also a summons to remember what happened the first time. Miraak's shadow falls across the later history of the Dragon War because he proves how easily freedom can become possession. His rebellion against the dragons should not be dismissed. A priest who turns his knowledge against the beings he served has made a dangerous and consequential choice. Yet his story does not end with a humble return to ordinary life. He wants power, and he wants it in a form that may replace the dragon hierarchy rather than abolish it. This is one of the oldest patterns in political history. The person who learns how the throne works begins by breaking the throne and ends by imagining himself seated upon it. Miraak's connection to the voice makes this pattern especially intimate. He does not need to become a dragon to imitate draconic authority. Language is enough. Knowledge is enough. The ability to command can reproduce the shape of the thing once opposed. When we think of the first Dragonborn, then, let the image remain divided. One half is a mortal standing against overwhelming power. The other is a man looking into that power and deciding he deserves more of it. His later association with Hermias Mora complicates the story further. Knowledge can liberate, but it can also become another kind of chain when the seeker cannot stop reaching for the next secret. The Dragon War is often told as a movement from oppression to freedom. Miraak asks us to add a question: freedom for whom and under whose voice? The Nords may have needed a champion, but a champion is still a person with fear, desire, and the ability to mistake victory for entitlement. In the quiet after the battle, a new order has to be built. Miraak's legend survives partly because it never gives us a comfortable answer about whether he was a hero who failed, a tyrant interrupted, or both at once. After the dragons withdrew, Skyrim had to learn how to live beneath an open sky. That sentence sounds peaceful, But peace after a long war is its own kind of labor. The Nords had lost people, homes, institutions, and certainty. The survivors carried the old hierarchy in their language, their tombs, and their stories, even as they rejected its authority. The mountains were no longer watched for the same reason, but they were not suddenly harmless. A dragon burial mound could become a landmark, a taboo, or a destination for those who wanted to claim the past. The voice could become a spiritual discipline rather than a weapon. Priestly masks could become relics rather than commands. None of these changes happened at one instant. They accumulated as generations grew up without seeing the old rulers. Memory softened some edges and sharpened others. The dragon became a monster in one story, a god in another, and an ancestor of the world in a third. This is how history becomes landscape. A ruin does not tell you whether the people inside it were loved. A barrow does not tell you whether its priest died defending a noble cause or a cruel system. A mountain ridge does not reveal how many eyes once turned toward it in fear. The listener who walks through Skyrim centuries later inherits all those layers without being able to separate them completely. That is why the Dragon War remains fertile ground for lore. It is not only a tale of an enemy defeated. It is a story about the making of historical memory. What gets preserved? What gets buried? And what returns when a later age needs an explanation for its own fears? The calm sky is not empty. It is carrying echoes. Somewhere in the wind is the old language. Somewhere under the snow is a mask. Somewhere in the silence is the question of whether the past has truly ended, or whether it is simply waiting for a voice to call it back. We can close the Dragon War where the mountains become quiet, but we should not pretend that quiet means erasure. The dragons changed Skyrim, and Skyrim changed the meaning of dragons. The old cult left tombs, masks, and habits of obedience. The Nords left songs about endurance, the voice, and the possibility that mortals could oppose beings who seemed eternal. Miraak left a warning about the closeness between liberation and ambition. Alduin left a name that could make an ordinary sky feel like the beginning of an ending. Later generations inherited all of it. If the war teaches one gentle lesson, it may be this: power often looks permanent only because people have been trained to imagine no alternative. The dragons seemed to belong above everyone else until mortals learned to speak back. The first answer was not perfect. It was not free of pride, contradiction, or violence, but it opened a space in which another future could be imagined. Let the final images move slowly. A dragon over a dark ridge, a priest mask resting in a sealed hall, a tablet whose carved shapes outlast the hand that made them, snow moving across an old barrow entrance. These are not just illustrations of events. They are reminders that history survives in objects after the people who gave those objects meaning are gone. The Dragon War is over as a campaign, but it continues as a pressure inside the Elder Scrolls world. It returns whenever a ruler claims to be beyond question, whenever a voice is used to command rather than understand, and whenever a buried name rises into the present. So rest with the sky for a moment. Above the mountains, dawn will eventually come. Beneath the stone, old bones will remain. The dragons are dead, absent, hidden, or waiting, depending on which story you trust. The Nords are still listening, and somewhere between breath and word, the ancient war continues to breathe. Before we leave the mountain, let us sit with the ordinary people who stood beneath it. A war remembered through kings and dragons can make the nameless disappear. But most of the Dragon War was lived by those without masks or titles. A mother carried water after a roof burned. A young scout learned which ravine held shelter when wings appeared above the snow. An old priest hid a tablet because destroying it felt like destroying the last proof that a different future had once been possible. A smith repaired a helmet that would be worn again before the metal cooled. A child learned the first shape of a warning word, then learned not to say it loudly. These details cannot be placed confidently into one dated chronicle, and so we offer them as human possibilities rather than secret facts. They help us remember what the grand language of the war can conceal. Freedom is experienced in kitchens, on roads, in burial chambers, and beside fires that must be lit again after an attack. The dragons occupied the sky, but the mortals defended the ground, one small task at a time. When later songs say that the Nords defeated the dragons, the sentence is true and incomplete. The victory belonged to the voices that became legendary and to the hands that never entered a song. It belonged to people who kept names alive when the old order demanded silence. It belonged to survivors who did not know whether their children would inherit peace, but built homes anyway. Perhaps the deepest meaning of the Dragon War rests there. The ancient world was not changed only by the final shout. It was changed by the accumulation of choices made before anyone knew which choice would matter. A door left open for a fleeing neighbor. A message carried through a storm. A grave marked with a simple stone. A refusal to bow, repeated until refusal became a tradition. If the mountains still seem to hold the war, it is because they hold those small acts as well as the dragon bones. The sky remembers fire. The earth remembers footsteps. And the human voice, soft at last, remembers that no power should be mistaken for eternity. Let that be the final breath of the episode, not a promise that every wound has healed, and not a claim that the old stories agree, but a small recognition that remembrance can resist disappearance. The dragons ruled through the certainty that they would always return. The Nords answered by making a future they could not yet see. And for a final moment, let the snow settle over the barrow. Nothing needs to be solved tonight. The story can remain beneath the stone, patient and unfinished, while the quiet returns. Let the last breath gentle, and let the old mountains keep their watch.